Speaking, I think hardly in any time we saw before, it was more important to be able to publicly speak no matter where you are. And today we have a special guest here. Graham Davies is not only one of Europe's, if not the world's most known speaker coaches. His clients reach from top-level CEOs to government officials in the UK. Hello and welcome, Graham Davies.
Good afternoon, Niels.
Thank you very much for taking the time. And of course, I prepared for this interview. And when we see what happens at the moment, we have many high-profile individuals who I assume, or I hope, were professionally trained when it comes to public speaking because they know how important it is. Still, we at the moment see them fail miserably. What, in your opinion, is the reason why people are unable to deliver a proper speech at this moment?
Well, it's an interesting assumption you made at the beginning about 60 seconds ago when you said that you assume a lot of people in the public eye at the top of corporates and the top of governments have had some formalized specialist speaker training. I would suggest to you that, in fact, the vast majority have not. They've approached speaking, presenting as a sport that they think they're innately good at. And they're certainly good at up to a certain level, but they've never really got to the absolute top level, frankly, because they haven't approached it professionally and they haven't had specific specialized coaching.
So let's say we have a rather critical situation. You are the top level CEO and you have to address maybe a political issue where you have to take a position, although you rather consider your brand as a politically neutral brand, if that exists in any way. How do people prepare for these kind of difficult speeches where no matter what you say, you're going to lose one side or the other?
In those sort of situations, you are doing essentially what I would call trying to tap dance on a sea of razor blades. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that you're not relying on spontaneous inspiration when you're in front of the camera, in front of the microphone, in front of your audience. You must make sure that you've calculated nearly all of the words that you're going to say precisely in advance. And what I recommend that people do in a very tricky situation like the one you've described is to make sure that everything they say is based around what I call a micro message. A micro message is a sequence of words which quickly and compellingly captures the essence of your particular idea, but in a way which is specifically tailored to the needs of that audience in that place at that time, and also specifically to that situation. That pre-speaking preparation process is even more vital when you're dealing with a politically tense situation like the one you've just described.
Very interesting what you just said. You said they need to plan everything in advance. And of course we both work in the speaking industry. We often hear that, speak from your heart. You just have to speak your heart out. Do you think that's wrong advice?
I believe that obviously you do need to have some emotion in what you're saying to get the relevant level of intensity in the words that you say, that you sound persuasive. But I would suggest to people, don't speak from your heart, speak from a script. Make sure that essentially most of the time you're using the words that you've calculated in advance, and only occasionally veer away from what you've calculated in advance. The analogy I would make would be one of skiing. Most of the time you should ski down the middle of the piste. Occasionally you should go off-piste, but only occasionally. You always need to get ready to get back to the mainstream in order to keep control of the effect that you're having with your words.
Let's take a situation which is a bit less difficult. Often people, and especially many people who listen to this podcast, are in the situation where, for example, as a sales team or as a sales leader, they have to present to different audiences, and especially when it is very technical. A lot of people who are asked in advance of this podcast said, well, I have a very dry topic. I am an engineer. Maybe I come from a background which is not to be known particularly entertaining, let's say German, no humor. And so how do I deal with a situation where I, let's say, speak to a C-level person who is rather interested in the outcome, and I am more on the market with a very technical background? How do I do that without becoming incredibly boring and incredibly technical?
Well, one of the ways in which people do become incredibly boring and incredibly technical is essentially to rely on PowerPoint or some other form of slide projection medium. And they feel that PowerPoint is almost as necessary as wearing a shirt and shoes to go into a meeting. And what they must do in order to make a technical subject come across, rather than relying on slides, which they essentially read a blizzard of bullet points from, they should make sure that they are concentrating on telling a short, pithy, precise story about the numbers, about the technical aspects, so that they're carrying along people in the audience, or on that, even if it's a one-person audience, with the narrative flow of the story, with the technical aspects or the numbers illustrating that story, rather than the technology and the numbers being all that they're getting across. It's the narrative flow that will mean that they become persuasive.
When we talk about storytelling, many people, of course, will say, I don't have any stories. I'm not entertaining. I'm not that kind of person. I don't have an interesting life. How do people approach storytelling when they tell you, I don't have any stories?
Well, actually, I mean storytelling in a subtly different way to the one that your question presupposes. I'm not necessarily using the word story to relate to how I got into university, how I then became a top-class runner. Then I went up and ran up Mount Everest, caught cancer, recovered on the way down. That's my personal story. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the concept of, if you have to get across the company's financial results and the implications of them to a small audience or a large audience, and you need to get a specific result or a specific action from that audience, you must make sure that you're telling the results as a story, which features numbers and statistics and financial results as characters, as it were, in that story. If you make sure that you've got a narrative flow, you can use numbers to be the characters in your story and be persuasive. I certainly don't suggest that people create stories which essentially are stories about themselves.
So, and again, this is one of the big myths, of course, which we have around when you just Google your presentation skills somewhere on the internet. Many people say you have to tell your story. When you have an interesting story, tell it to the audience. Would you say stories about yourself are less helpful than other stories?
I think they're very 1980s. In the professional speaking industry in the 1980s and 1990s, people were obsessed with telling long personal stories about themselves and their families, their distant cousins, their own achievements. But nowadays, even pre-COVID, people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And I think that people in the audiences are always crying out for, please get to the point. Don't just tell me about yourself and your grandchildren. Tell me about something that makes a difference to me, my life, my business, and do it immediately.
Yeah, excellent. So what about the question that, of course, has to come up when we talk about presenting? Someone works for the financial department and has to present the annual numbers game, which probably is top one on the list of most boring things to do on planet Earth. How is it possible when you have to present that? It's an obligation, maybe even a legal obligation. You have to present it, but you want to make it memorable and maybe even not boring, maybe even entertaining. But how is it possible to deal with that kind of material towards an audience that most likely is used to seeing a PowerPoint slide with a copied Excel spreadsheet on it?
Well, of course, PowerPoint can be a very powerful tool, but it should be used very sparingly, like caviar, and not ladled on like a thick dollop of British marmalade. And inevitably, in financial presentations, and I'll call it, for the purposes of this question, financial storytelling, slides must form part of the story, because I do accept that there are certain concepts in presentation that do need a visual aspect to them. You can't beat a graph when it comes to describing what the stock market is doing in a particular time. Pie charts are excellent in trying to see exactly what your market share is. And there are other very good, striking examples of the way in which pictures can illustrate things better than words can on their own. However, lots and lots of bullet points and lots of numbers in columns or in squares don't really illustrate things brilliantly as an additional weapon to words on their own. They have to be used in a way, slides have to be used in a way so that they become genuinely visual, not just a way of putting numbers across. And so that's number one, they have to be used visually. Number two, you should make sure that you decide what you're going to say before you start designing and creating your slides. Work out your story, work out a script, and then, having practiced and honed that script, then think which parts of the script would be enhanced and given more impact by using some powerful visual slides. Most people think of the slides first and then think of what to say. I think it should be the other way around.
Excellent advice. Thank you very much for that. And of course, one of the questions I received in advance from people who are in business for a very long time, they feel reasonably comfortable presenting, but they say they struggle more and more when it comes to use humor. Of course, as a German, I have no idea what that even meant, so I tried to... So people struggle more and more. They are in the situation and say, can I say that? Can't I say that? Am I crossing a line? Am I not crossing a line? Am I crossing it in a way which people will find funny? Or am I crossing it in a way where people will call me out on being offensive? How do I find the right spot for humor? Because often they say, when you play it very safe, it's just not funny anymore.
Yes, and indeed, I do have to accept, even though there was a time, say, 10 years ago, when 90% of my speaking was at 10 o'clock at night, and 90% of my material was in fact one-liner jokes, some of which were, I have to accept, really rather risque. And so this is a very thin razor blade across which I have been walking for many, many years. And the other thing that I do have to accept that is a problem is the fact that social media, we're saturated with access to social media at all times, 24 hours of the day. Most of us have our smartphones with us literally all the time. Yeah. And it means that we get exposed to an awful lot of opinions all the time as well. And I think that there has been an increase in this type of person, the type of person who is always looking for the opportunity to be offended. And you have to accept that the proportion of people in the population that has that characteristic is increasing all the time. The only way, therefore, to make sure that you only use humor as appropriate is to make sure that you calculate that humor very carefully indeed. And indeed, for instance, there was a particular, I remember actually, there was, I know you personally were in an audience that I spoke to in Dallas a couple of years ago, and there was a particular gag that I wanted to use that from your experience, I knew you might have an opinion on it. And I ran that gag past you before doing it in front of the audience because I wanted to make sure that there was no chance of offending people with that particular joke. And I needed somebody's objective assessment. You have to do that audience analysis, preferably with people who are going to be in that audience, to be absolutely certain that you're entertaining and not upsetting them.
Excellent. That is very good. And,
I'd like to bring something else up, if you don't mind, from that question that you asked about Germans having no sense of humour. Well, forgive me. My experience has been different in relation to that question. One of the things one of the reasons why I think that Brits and Germans get on very well these days is that they have something in common. They're proud of their countries, but they're also deeply aware of their own national characteristics. Both Brits and Germans are delighted to laugh at themselves and to laugh at their own nationalities. And therefore, they can laugh at each other as well. And that's what makes humour a really, really rich thing.
Well, as a German, of course, I have to say humor is inefficient, and if I use it, I lose my German citizenship. So that's, of course, not possible.
And long may that continue, Niels.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Shifting away from the boardroom, I received a couple of questions in advance where people said, I think I have the experience to be reasonably okay in the boardroom. I am terrified when at 4 p.m. my boss comes to me and say, could you just go to that networking meeting? It's just like a short speech. And suddenly you have to say something in a non-business, well, it is a business environment, but people are standing there, maybe had a drink or two, and people just have no idea what to say, especially because they don't have PowerPoint. They only get a microphone. They, of course, because they sponsor the evening, they want to sell their brand, but they don't want to sound salesy. They want to sound funny, but they have no idea how to do this usual networking speech thing. Do you have any advice for them?
Yes, and I sympathize with somebody who suddenly feels a dark feeling of blackness in their guts when they're given that request. Because there is a huge difference between the atmosphere of sitting around a boardroom table in front of 10 of your close colleagues, and admittedly they're 10 highly competent and very powerful people, but there is a different feeling when you suddenly have to stand up in front of, say, 50 or 100 strangers, many of whom are also standing as well and not sitting and relaxed. So undoubtedly, there is a huge difference in the emotional impact on you as a speaker. But I would give the same advice, whether it's speaking to 10 people in front of a boardroom table or 100 people in front of a networking scenario. You must sit down and prepare a precise, careful script in advance. Mm-hmm. And you start off that preparation by working out what your micro message is. What would you like to make sure that the audience remember above all else from your presentation? Write down that first and write it out in full, and then think of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 points that illustrate, that support that micro message. And make sure that you prepare words that are concise and precise, and make sure you prepare it in advance and rehearse it in advance so that you are used to the idea of saying those words in front of a large stand-up audience, and it's not something that you're just saying for the first time in front of them.
Very good. That is very helpful advice. Thank you very much. Of course, I'm going to put your contact data and your website in the show notes of this podcast. And well, to wrap this all up, there's only one thing I have left to say. Graham, thank you very much for your time.
Niels, it's been a pleasure.